Skeletal evidence also changes in this period, and it changes everywhere, in ways far more honest than any later text. Human bone is an unforgeable survival log. Bone density tracks nutrition. Bone shape reflects labor patterns. Tooth wear and cavities reveal diet. Cranial trauma marks violence. Growth arrest lines store stress events. When archaeologists systematically compare Mesolithic hunter-gatherers with Neolithic farming populations, they do not see a simple story of progress. They see a social transformation paid for by bodies. Height declines, tooth decay explodes, anemia-related lesions rise, spinal degeneration increases, trauma increases. These are not ideas. They are costs written into skeletons. Height is one of the clearest markers. Mesolithic European male average height was roughly 170 to 175 centimeters, female roughly 160 to 165. In the early Neolithic, through the Bronze Age transition, skeletal samples show a clear decline. Height is a long-term recorder of nutrition, especially childhood protein and calcium intake. Farming diets centered on grains, rich in carbohydrates but lower in protein quality and micronutrient density than diverse hunter-gatherer diets. Only after modern nutrition science and broad food diversity in the 20th century did average height in many populations return to or surpass hunter-gatherer baselines. This directly challenges a linear story where civilization automatically means better life. Over the long run, civilization brought technology and organization, but for ordinary bodies, it was not necessarily an immediate benefit. Dental evidence is even more dramatic. Mesolithic teeth show very low cavity rates. In the Neolithic, grains became staple foods, feeding carcinogenic bacteria in the mouth, and cavity rates rose sharply. Periodontal infections left holes and bone resorption in jaws. In societies without modern dentistry, severe tooth infection can be fatal. Farming altered the oral microbiome, and the skeletal record shows that shift as catastrophic. Porotic hyperostosis and cribrorbitalia, linked to iron deficiency anemia, increased significantly in farming samples. Grain-based diets are low in iron and often inhibit absorption. Higher population density increases parasite and infection risk. Frequent childbirth further depletes maternal iron stores. These changes leave permanent marks, especially in children's bones. Harris lines, healed growth interruption marks, are also denser in agricultural samples, implying more frequent childhood stress. Sedentism tied people to land and to harvest risk. Hunter-gatherer mobility had been a risk management tool. Farming traded movement for output, but turned risk into a cyclical fate. Changes in labor are also carved into bones. Enthesis changes reveal repetitive work patterns. In Neolithic female skeletons, spinal and upper limb changes consistent with grinding grain are so typical that archaeologists sometimes call it the grinder's spine. Male skeletons show degenerative changes consistent with heavy cultivation in the lumbar spine and hips. Agriculture is not only a production method. It is a method of shaping bodies into continuous labor machines. Patterns of violence also shift. Mesolithic violence exists but tends to match small-scale interband conflict. In the Neolithic, many parts of Europe show skeletal evidence of organized massacre. Britain has fewer extreme cases, but broader trends still suggest higher rates of lethal trauma. Malnutrition and violence reinforce each other, scarcity drives conflict, conflict disrupts production, and the loop intensifies. Part of why states later emerged and stabilized is that they transformed scattered violence into monopolized violence, and turned chaotic raiding into taxation and conscription. The state is both a product of the problem and a manager of the problem, and the management cost is still paid by ordinary bodies. Agricultural society did not only change power structures, it literally reshaped the human body. The people running through Star-Kar wetlands had strong bones, healthy teeth, and were not short. Their bodies were normal for their time. What we imagine as the brutal hardship before civilization may not have been worse, at least at the level of bones, than later farming life. This does not paint hunter-gatherers as utopian. It simply reminds us that costs do not vanish just because we label something civilization. So what pushed so many people onto a path that made bodies worse? Anthropologist James C. offers a sharp explanation in Against the Grain: Early History of the First States. The key is not that people eagerly chose agriculture, but that states favor certain crops, especially grains, because grains and states have a structural fit. Grains concentrate above ground, ripen in a short window, and can be seen, counted, stored, seized, and taxed. Root crops remain underground, hard to quantify and confiscate, and are naturally harder to bring into a tax base. Grains make society legible. Settled villages, bounded fields, estimable yields, centralized storage. These are the conditions that let power solidify into institutions. Mobile hunter-gatherers are hard for states to absorb, not only because they are dispersed, but because their wealth is immediate and non-accumulable. It cannot sit in place, waiting for a tax collector. In Britain's later historical echo, this logic returns in a nearly cruel form. After the Norman conquest, the Domesday Book of 1086 carried out a systematic survey of land, livestock, and wealth. It depended on the quantifiable wealth structures built over millennia of agricultural life. If Britain had still been hunter-gatherer, such a census would have been meaningless. There would be no stationary tax base to register. What the state needs is not wealth in a general sense, but wealth that can be recorded, collected, and transported. Grains and land fit that need. Scott also points out that in many regions, there is a long gap between the appearance of agricultural techniques and full agricultural dependence. People did not necessarily make grain their staple immediately. Full transition often requires external pressure, compressed living space, environmental change, rising population density, or the formation of power structures. Britain's storyline fits. The flooding of Dogger land compressed hunter-gatherer space, then farming migrants added new production and population pressure. The combination pushed an irreversible reorganization. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to build a state. The state grows as pressures stack, and grain provides the skeleton it grows on. The state was not suddenly invented. It emerged from long accumulated ecological, demographic, and economic constraints. As population density rises, resources become less abundant, and land becomes wealth, the mobile sharing-based hunter-gatherer form becomes harder to sustain. Surplus allows some people to detach from direct production. Priests, chiefs, and professional warrior strata appear. Institutional authority hardens. Violence becomes organized, shifting from occasional intergroup clashes to structured warfare. This is not because humans became worse. It is because structure changed. When wealth can be stored and inherited, when people are fixed to land, when risk becomes periodic harvest failure, power will appear in some form to coordinate, allocate, and coerce. So the Britain that had no king, no taxes, and no state machine did not exist because human nature was kinder. It existed because of low population density, abundant resources, and high mobility. Once those conditions changed, social form changed with them. The state is not humanity's starting point. It is an organizational form generated under specific constraints. It solved coordination problems in farming societies, and at the same time created the structural conditions for exploitation, taxation, and war. If we pull the camera further back, Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. The history of states is at most 5,000 years. Before Britain became an empire, it had about 6,000 years of a stateless era. That fact is not only an archaeological finding. It forces a rethink. In the full coordinate system of human history, are government, taxation, borders, and sovereignty universal laws, or an experiment that is still unfinished?